take it or leave it. And that really in Australia has been pretty much how the policy process has happened. We have to negotiate this idea of worthiness, and I'd say see it as an investment in the future of a country, because in a multicultural country like Australia, the only thing which sets Australia apart from other multicultural countries around the world is its unique Indigenous heritage. It's something we celebrate at national events, but as soon as the national event's over, we tell the people, you can go back to your communities now, we don't need you anymore. I think there needs to be a better relationship than that. And I guess public policy making is far too important to be left to policymakers. Community members have to become engaged and active in this, because otherwise decisions are going to be made by other people. And I think, finally, and this was a real shock to me, I must admit, when I interviewed a whole lot of public policy makers, people who'd worked with prime ministers and the government for decades, they essentially said, policy change will only happen when the stars align. In other words, no matter how hard you work on a project, no matter how hard you lobby, it will only happen when all of the elements come together. And maybe that's something that's in the lap of the gods. I don't know. Cheers.
Review the speech in Mandarin Chinese. OK， 所以非常感谢Professor Michael Meadows， 我想在他刚刚非常深刻的一个演讲内容里面分享了整个澳洲的原住民的媒体发展的经验。那我想其实在这里面有几个很关键的重点，是我个人觉得收获很大的那我想第一个是说，其实Professor Meadows 他告诉我们说，其实现在澳洲的这些原住民媒体，第一个是说它其实有非常多不同种类的原住民媒体的发展。其实澳洲现在有除了他们的 NITV 一个全国性的原住民的电视台，还有一个社区的这个原住民的电视台。除此之外，它其实有上百个社区媒体、社区广播。所以我想，其实原住民媒体的发展在澳洲其实是非常蓬勃的。那也因为这样的蓬勃发展，其实而且包括说很重要的是，他们的澳洲的原住民的社区媒体，它打破了传统的媒体生产者跟这个乐听人之间的这样的距离，那彼此的对话跟分享，所以它形成了一个非常多元而丰富的原住民的公共领域那它也使得他们可以去传承他们的传统文化跟他们的传统知识那当然他也谈到说，那当然澳洲这个经验里面确实还是有一些这个有一些值得再省思的地方比如说在澳洲这么广大的一片土地，然后那么多种族可能包括200种以上的原住民的不同的部落，那其实他们也存在的所谓的城市的原住民跟这个比较rural 或者是比较丛林地区的原住民，他们之间其实有一个还蛮大的 gap。所以这也是为什么澳洲电视台会有这 NITV 跟这个 STV 这样的一个存在的一个分野所以我想这也是在澳洲他们所面临的问题。那最后呢Professor Meadows 他也告诉我们说，其实在原住民的传播政策的这个部分那我想，但在这部分我相信台湾其实在原住民传播政策上面也确实是走得非常的进步那我们现在有原住民的文化基金会然后我们也有很多这个针对这几年一直有针对这个原住民传播政策的一些提出可是那他也谈到说，这个政策的制定呢，其实也要同时能够去容忍很多不同的意见的存在，而且那是一种非常不同的多层次的一些协商那这个政策制定的他谈到最后很关键的是说，那政策制定也不是只有这个政策制定者本身的工作而已，他们的责任而已那我相信这个其实是我们更多原住民的，尤其是我们在原住民的部落里面、社区里面从事不管是社区工作、媒体工作还有包括我们原住民的媒体工作者，甚至于是主流的社会关心原住民的媒体事务发展的应该都可以进入这样的对话跟政策制定的过程那我也希望说 Professor Meadows 给我们的这样的澳洲的经验跟提醒也可以给我们目前所要面对的包括我们原住民的电视台还包括我们其他的各个领域的原住民媒体的发展都有很好的省思。好，那我做一个这样的简单的回顾。那我们有一个 Q&A 的时间我现在就把这个时间开放给现场，不知道我们现场有没有什么样子的问题想要请教Professor Meadows。Okay, so now it's Q&A time. Okay, there are two persons. Raise your hands. So first, please.
I think it is very hard to escape the conclusion that politics play a key role in this game. So I am wondering, in your view, from your observation and your research, do you think who are the members of this indigenous public sphere? I mean, what is the inclusive and exclusive boundary? And does it really encourage public engagement of all public citizens, or just indigenous people only? And what do you think the consequences of this boundary?
Thank you very much. It's a very good question, one that I've thought long and hard about and written to some extent about. But my conception of the indigenous public sphere is one that's created by indigenous people and indigenous discourses. So it's a very broad concept of everything and anything that indigenous people do makes up the indigenous world. And so the sphere is formed through daily activities, through media, of course, play a central role in this in the same way that it plays in forming the mainstream public sphere today for all of us. But I guess it's if we think about concept with the overlapping public spheres that I mentioned, Nancy Fraser has spoken about, that gives a sort of sense that it overlaps with other kinds of spheres. For example, there are leaky boundaries, I think, between the indigenous public sphere and the mainstream public sphere, if I can use those terms. So every now and then, ideas will drift into the mainstream public sphere from an indigenous public sphere. And in that way, there is a kind of an exchange. I'm not saying that that it happens a lot, but the opportunity for that is there. And I think, as I suggested, is that me or maybe it's that one? So that the opportunity exists for some kind of exchange, and I think that's the notion that there is a way of thinking. Gail Valaskarkas, who unfortunately passed away several years ago, a Canadian scholar who wrote a lot about native North Americans, suggested the idea of thinking of two different worlds. There's an indigenous world and a non-indigenous world, and the two worlds tend to run in parallel, but occasionally they cross. There are lines of communication, and I guess it's where the indigenous public sphere and the non-indigenous public sphere cross over at those points. It could be through, for example, I guess dispelling stereotypes, the cross-cultural dialogue that I mentioned. And I think those kinds of ideas do find their way into public sphere debate at particular moments. As I said, the policy process is very, very difficult to predict. You know, we have to wait till the planets get in the right alignment, as they symbolically. But when it does happen, and when those ideas are there, they can be enlisted and used at particular moments. So I think the advice that I would have for Indigenous communities is that they need to have ideas ready to go at any time, so that when the policy environment, when the mainstream public sphere opens its doors and says, we want to do something, we've got some funding, we want to engage the community, Indigenous community more, what can we do? Well then, of course, communities go into a panic and say, what can we do? We've got to come up with an idea. And so people, the communities have to already have those ideas ready to go. If they've got plans for expansion of communication ready, well then that moment can be seized, and I think that's where there's a crossover between the Indigenous public sphere and the mainstream public sphere. There's a communication, a line of communication. I think it's a kind of a difficult concept, but I think when you go into Indigenous communities and you spend time there, you realise that this sphere is all encompassing. Everyone knows everyone else. People are often related through kinship, but through friendship and other ways. And I guess it's that way of thinking is very different from a non-Indigenous perspective. But there is an overlap, and where that overlap happens is where the likelihood of communication and dialogue will take place. That's the way I see it. I hope that answers your question.
Good morning, Michael. So there are two. Good morning, Michael. So there are 2 television channels, more than 200 radio stations, and a website. Actually, I'll watch it from time to time. So it seems there are so many media to do the communication service for the Aboriginal peoples. But I want to know, according to your understanding, how about Aboriginal people? Do they happy or satisfied about this communication service? Do they think that those media really practice their communication right? So what's the expectation of this media can do for them?
Well, I can say without any doubt at all in my own mind that Indigenous people value their communication services extraordinarily. In some ways, access to communication has enabled Indigenous people to counter many of the negative experiences they have with mainstream society through all of those other services, through health, housing, discrimination and so on. When they have access to their own media, they have control, and I think that's the difference. When we were doing our study of audiences, and we were parked by the roadside in the central desert, there was a big ceremony taking place, and people were driving past the vehicle where we were waiting, and this four-wheel drive stopped, and an old Aboriginal woman was sitting in the front, and she said out the window, "Are you the fellas who are doing this survey?" And we said, "Yes." And she said, "I want to talk to you." And we thought, "Oh, we're in trouble here," but she said, "I want to tell you how important this media is for me and my children." She was a grandmother, and she spoke to us for about 20 minutes without a breath, telling us how important this was for the children, for the community, for the sense of self-worth. That was one example, but all over Australia, Indigenous audiences we spoke to said the same thing. This was the only place where Indigenous voices could be heard without any kind of mediation, without having to go through a white manager or a non-Indigenous person. One other example I'll give you quickly is I showed you a picture of Palm Island in those photographs in far north Queensland. I mentioned that Palm Island had lots of domestic issues and social problems. In 2004, a young Aboriginal man who was in police custody on Palm Island died. He was assaulted by police and he died. The community marched on the police station and threatened the police, and they ended up burning down the station. The station was burnt down because they were so angry at what had happened. Another death in custody. It wasn't just one. There'd been several deaths in custody on the island and hundreds around Australia over the last 10 years. Now, when the media reported that issue, the mainstream media talked about that as a riot. And in fact, there was no riot. No one was hurt. The police were threatened, certainly, but you know, a riot usually means there's people fighting and so on, but the media immediately framed that as a riot. When I went up there a year later to talk to people on the Indigenous radio station, they spoke about it as the resistance. And I think there's a very different perspective. The mainstream media saw it as a riot, the Indigenous media saw it as a resistance. And I think that in many ways sums up the different perspectives and the feelings that people have about the power that their own radio and television access gives them.
So let's have the last question, please.
Thank you for your speech. I really enjoyed it. One question is, media, you need content. And therefore, I'm thinking about